The last several chapters of this class are going to be about the nervous system. So we're going to start with looking at nerve cells and nervous tissue. So what are the functions of nerves? The main function of nervous tissue is communication. So communicating between our brain and our muscles to perform actions, as well as communicating between our sensory input and our brain. They do this through sending chemical and electrical signals. So we're going to break down those chemical and electrical signals this chapter and look at the action potential, which is their kind of unit of communication. Cells in the nervous system can only communicate with adjacent cells. So in order to communicate with the whole body, we have to have nerve cells throughout the entire body so that we can pass signals. It's kind of like a relay race where the action potential is passed from one cell to the next cell to the next cell until it finally gets to the muscle or gland or brain or wherever it was going. These are extremely fast, so the communication is almost instantaneous. Our nervous system is divided based on where it exists. So we have the central nervous system, the CNS, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, which are all axial, right along the center axis of the body. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, PNS, which is pretty much all of the nerves that come off of the spinal cord and then reach out to your muscles and glands. And we're going to break down in detail the brain, the spinal cord, as well as the autonomic nervous system in later chapters. So just like muscle cells had properties, neurons have properties. And one of those is excitability, which is similar to muscle cells. And this is going to be the ability to create an action potential. And this is going to allow these cells to respond to information being put in and then create this excited state, this action potential. And then more importantly for communication is conductivity. So this is going to allow us to pass the action potential from the dendrites along the axon all the way down to the axon terminals. So this is the conduction of that action potential along the length of the cell, and then secretion is going to happen at the end of the neuron to allow it to communicate to the next cell in line. And the chemical signal that we're going to secrete is called a neurotransmitter. And this is going to tell the next cell, whether it's a nerve cell or a muscle cell, to be stimulated as well. There are generally 3 different functions of neurons, 3 different methods of communication, if you will. Sensory neurons or afferent neurons are going to detect stimuli. These here you can see are the neurons in the finger that can detect the things that you're feeling. These would be also things inside the body that detect things like blood pressure, heart rate, blood oxygen level, as well as your sensory organs, your eyes, your ears, your nose. Anything that senses something either outside your body or inside your body is a sensory neuron. These are typically first in line, so usually we respond to stimuli because we sensed a stimulus. And so these are termed afferent. A comes first in the alphabet. They send a signal, typically to an interneuron. Interneurons are either in the spinal cord or in the brain, so they're only in the central nervous system. And interneurons are for processing. If it's a really quick reflex, it might get processed very quickly in the spinal cord and then sent right back. If this is a thought that needs a little bit more processing, it might go all the way up to the brain to be processed. And then eventually a signal is sent in response to a motor or efferent neuron. So remember, A comes first and then E comes after A. So that's how I remember afferent versus efferent. So a motor neuron is going to signal a gland or a muscle to have some kind of physical response to the stimulus that we received. Here you can see the structure of a typical neuron. So up here we have the neurosoma, which is the body. So in here it's just written soma. You can also call it the neurosoma. You can also call it the body. This is where most of the cell organelles are. So this is where it's going to have the mitochondria, the ribosomes, all of your cellular membranes, all of the stuff that we saw in cells earlier are going to mostly be here. Here we've got the nucleus, the nucleolus. Dendrites are the signal receiving area of a neuron. Notice that there's a lot of them branched out like a tree. And this is so they can receive signals from a lot of different adjacent neurons. The trigger zone is made up of the axon hillock and the first segment. So this kind of triangular region that next down is going to be the axon hillock, and this is where action potentials start. So this is typically where we're going to be getting excited. And then the action potentials are transmitted down the axon. So this is the long axon. And because these cells need to be adjacent, it makes sense for them to be very long so they can reach a far distance to the next cell. The axolemma is the cell membrane. Just like in muscles, it was called the sarcolemma. And then, so you can see that cell membrane right here. And then the axoplasm is the cytoplasm. And again, these are just getting special names for structures that you already know. The axon terminal are the little swollen ends at the very end of the axon. Notice that these branch off as well, giving it the ability to stimulate many different muscle fibers in a motor unit. So the axon terminal is where it's going to do secretion. The axon itself is what allows for conduction. And you'll notice that there's small kind of bundles as we go along here. So these are myelin sheath, and you can see kind of a zoomed in image right here. The myelin sheath is a conductive wrapping around the axon, and this is going to help the signal move faster. What it does is it allows the signal to kind of jump between these nodes. And these spaces between the myelin sheath are called the node of Ranvier. It's French, so you don't pronounce the R. The node of Ranvier. And it's going to allow the signal to conduct by jumping between these nodes rather than having to go along the entire signal. An internode is the space on the axon between the nodes, so it's the space that's covered up by the myelin sheath, because you're not going to see action potentials be conducted through there. They just kind of skip over that part to go faster. Not every neuron is covered in myelin sheath. Most of the ones in white matter that need to conduct really fast signals are covered in myelin sheath. However, gray matter is going to be neurons that are not covered in myelin. So what we just saw was a typical multipolar neuron. So it's going to typically have one axon and many dendrites. And so you can see there's a couple of other shapes of multipolar neurons over here. Neurons come in other different shapes. Bipolar, meaning that it only has one axon and one dendrite. So here's one axon, here's one dendrite. Unipolar, meaning that there's actually only one process. So here's the one process, and then the cell body's kind of off on the side. We'll see these in the spinal nerves, which have kind of collections of ganglia. And then anaxonic, meaning there's no really long axon on here. It's pretty much all dendrites and then a soma or cell body. So take a moment and reflect on the typical structure of a neuron. Describe as many structures in as much detail as you can.